The date is January 5th, 1757. In the freezing shadows of the Palace of Versailles, a kingdom is about to shatter, not under the roar of cannons, but by the whisper of a penknife. King Louis XV, the absolute monarch of France, descends the marble instruction of the Escalier d'Ambassadeurs. Torches flicker against the winter wind, casting long, dancing shadows against the gilded walls that house the most powerful court in Europe. The air smells of snow, expensive perfume, and the underlying stench of thousands of unwashed bodies packed into the royal residence. As the king moves toward his waiting carriage, surrounded by the Swiss Guard and the highest nobility of the land, a figure detaches itself from the darkness. There is no shout, no declaration of war, just a rush of movement and a dull thud as steel meets silk. The king staggers, clutching his side, his white shirt rapidly blooming with a crimson stain that looks black in the moonlight. In this single, chaotic heartbeat, the divine invincibility of the French monarchy is pierced. What follows this moment is not a trial, but a descent into a nightmare so vivid, so mechanically cruel, that will haunt the collective psyche of Paris for centuries. This is the story of François Damiens, and the 72 hours of calculated agony that France inflicted upon him to prove that their king was still a god. To understand the horror of the punishment, we must understand the impossibility of the crime. In 1757, the king was not merely a head of state, he was the lieutenant of God, anointed with holy oil at Reims. To strike him was not assault, it was sacrilege. It was stabbing heaven itself. And the man who held the knife was nobody. François Damiens, born in 1715 in the muddy provincial town of Artois, was a ghost in the machine of French society. He was a domestic servant, a man who had spent his life pouring wine and folding linens, invisible to the eyes of the powerful. But behind the deferential bow of the servant, a storm was brewing. Damiens was a man possessed, not by demons, but by the violent theological schism tearing France apart, the war between the Jesuits and the Jansenists. This was no dry academic debate. It was a spiritual civil war fought in pulpits and pamphlets over the nature of free will and grace. Damiens, obsessive and unstable, haunted the steps of the Palais de Justice, his ears burning as he listened to lawyers and clerks whisper treason. He absorbed the toxic fumes of political theology he barely understood, convinced that Louis XV was leading souls to damnation by siding with the Jesuits. He had no co-conspirators, no shadowy network of assassins, no foreign gold, just a confused, burning conviction that if he could bleed the king just a little, he might shock the monarch back to godliness. Security at Versailles was a paradox. It was the most guarded building in the world, yet it was open to everyone. The monarchy relied on the mystique of kingship, the belief that the king's body was so sacred, no one would dare touch it. Damiens walked through the golden gates with a knife in his pocket, unnoticed because he looked like everyone else, a petitioner, a servant, a nobody. When he struck, the blade, a small penknife with a blade barely 4 inches long, passed through the king's heavy velvet winter coat, through layers of silk and linen, and entered the body between the 4th and 5th ribs. "I am wounded," the king cried, looking at his hand, wet with his own blood. "Seize that man, but do not kill him." The chaos that erupted was absolute. Courtiers fainted. Dukes drew swords. The Dauphin, the king's son, caught his father as his knees buckled. Louis XV, terrified of death, began frantically confessing his sins to a priest right there on the cold stones, believing his soul was about to depart. But the physical reality was anticlimactic. The royal surgeons, arriving with their terrifying array of probes and bandages, found that the knife had glanced off a rib. It hadn't pierced the lung. It hadn't touched the heart. It was, medically speaking, a flesh wound. The king would be walking within days. But the body of the king was more than flesh. It was a symbol, and that symbol had been violated. While the king lay in his bed of state, terrified and weeping, Damiens was dragged into the bowels of the Conciergerie prison. This medieval fortress on the Isle de la Cite was the antechamber of death. The air here was thick with the smell of mold and old fear. The interrogators faced a problem that their minds refused to accept. Damiens claimed he acted alone. To the aristocratic mind, regicide required a conspiracy. It required grand plots, foreign agents, Protestant spies. It could not be the work of one confused servant with a pocket knife. They needed names. And to get names, the French legal system had a solution: the question. In the Ancien Régime, torture was not a bug in the system. It was a feature. It was a highly regulated, bureaucratic procedure. There was the question ordinaire, ordinary torture, and the question extraordinaire, extraordinary torture. Damiens, a regicide, was destined for both. They took him to the torture chamber, a room illuminated by the guttering light of torches, the walls stained by centuries of suffering. They introduced him to the brodequins, or the boots. This was not a quick lashing. It was slow, hydraulic destruction. Damiens was strapped into a chair, his legs encased in tight wooden casings that ran from knee to ankle. The torturer, a professional tradesman, inserted wooden wedges between the casing and the flesh. He raised a heavy mallet. Thud! The first wedge drove in. The wood compressed the muscle against the bone. A scribe sat nearby, quill poised over parchment, waiting for names. Damiens screamed, but he gave no names. "It was me," he gasped. "Only me." Thud! The fourth wedge. The question ordinaire was complete. The pressure was now crushing the tibia, but the judges were not satisfied. They ordered the question extraordinaire. The mallet swung again. 8 wedges. 10 wedges. By the 12th wedge, the interrogation had transcended pain and entered the realm of butchery. The bones of his lower legs were not just broken. They were pulverized, the marrow crushed into the muscle. The doctors, monitoring his pulse, declared he could take no more without dying. And he could not die. Not yet. His death belonged to the public. They let him heal. For weeks, Damiens lay in the dark, his legs useless sacks of shattered bone, while physicians tended to him with the solicitude of farmers fattening a prize hog for slaughter. Then they brought him back. This time, for the question d'eau, the water torture. They strapped him to a trestle, binding him so tight the ropes cut into his skin. They forced a horn into his mouth to keep it open and placed a linen cloth over his face. Then they began to pour. Gallon after gallon of water was forced into his stomach, the cloth simulating the sensation of drowning with every breath. He bloated, suffocated, and convulsed, his body fighting for air that wouldn't come. Casanova, the famous libertine who later heard the details from court insiders, noted with a shudder that Damiens never wavered. Through the drowning and the crushing, his story remained the terrifying truth. There was no conspiracy, just one man and his rage. On March 28, 1757, the machinery of justice was finally ready to complete its work. The sentence handed down by the Parliament of Paris was a masterpiece of archaic cruelty, digging up punishments that hadn't been used since the assassination of Henri IV by François Ravaillac in 1610. The goal was not just death, but the total obliteration of the criminal. The morning of the execution dawned gray and cold. The Place de Grève, the theater of Parisian justice, was packed. Windows overlooking the square were rented out for fortunes. Aristocrats, ladies in fine silk dresses, and common laborers stood shoulder to shoulder. The atmosphere was grotesque, a carnival of death. Hawkers sold wine and sausages. People placed bets on how long the man would last. It was a festival, and Damiens was the main attraction. At 2 p.m., Damiens was brought out. He was a ruin of a man, unable to walk, dragged onto the scaffold by the assistance of Charles-Henri Sanson, the high executioner of France. Sanson, a man who viewed himself as a practitioner of a dark art, looked over his instruments. The fire was already burning. The sentence was read aloud, a checklist of horrors. First, the hand that held the knife. They strapped his right arm to a wooden block. In the brazier, a mixture of sulfur was burning. Sanson took the hand that had touched the king, and thrust it into the fire. The smell of burning flesh rolled over the front rows of the crowd. Damiens screamed, a sound that rose above the murmur of the thousands. Next came the pincers. These were massive iron tongs, heated until they glowed a dull, menacing red in the afternoon light. The executioners moved with practiced rhythm. They tore at the flesh of his chest, his arms, his thighs. The sentence demanded that into these raw, cauterized wounds, they pour a mixture of molten lead, boiling oil, and burning resin. Steam hissed as the liquids hit the open wounds. The agony is unimaginable to the modern mind. Casanova, watching from a rented window, wrote that he had to turn away and cover his ears, while the ladies next to him watched with unblinking fascination. But the centerpiece of the execution was the écartèlement, quartering by horses. This was the moment the crowd had waited for. 4 heavy draft horses were led onto the square, their breath steaming in the chill air. Ropes were tied to Damien's arms and legs, and the other ends harnessed to the animals. The theory was simple physics. 4 horses pulling in opposite directions would tear the body apart. The drivers cracked their whips. The horses lunged. The ropes snapped taut, lifting Damien's body into the air, suspending him like a grotesque marionette. The crowd gasped, but the body did not tear. Human tendons are incredibly strong, and the horses, unused to this kind of resistance, slipped on the cobblestones. They pulled again and again. For an hour, the animals strained, and Damien's incredibly was still alive, his joints dislocated, his body stretched but whole. He was muttering prayers, looking at his own limbs with wide, shock-filled eyes. The execution was turning into a farce. The crowd grew restless. The magistrates, sitting in their velvet chairs, debated in hushed tones. The law said, pulled apart by horses, but physics was disagreeing. Finally, as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the blood-slicked scaffold, the order was given. Sanson drew a knife. He moved to the limbs, cutting through the thick tendons at the shoulders and hips, severing the tough fibers that held the man together. It was evening when the last of François Damiens was thrown onto the pyre. The sentence demanded that nothing remain. His body, his clothes, the very wood he had bled on, all of it was consumed by flames that leaped 15 feet into the night sky. The authorities wanted him erased. His house was razed to the ground. His family was forced to change their name and banished from France. The name Damiens was forbidden to be spoken. But as the smoke drifted over the Seine, settling into the lungs of the Parisians, something had changed. The sheer brutality of the spectacle had backfired. Instead of seeing the majesty of the king's justice, the people saw the desperate cruelty of a dying system. Voltaire wrote that the execution degraded the nation more than the criminal. The Marquis de Sade, young and impressionable, saw in it the true face of power, that civilization was just a thin veneer over savagery. The irony is the sharpest blade of all. Louis XV, the man Damiens died to save, lived for another 17 years, dying of smallpox in 1774, rotting in his bed while his courtiers fled the smell. The torture of Damiens didn't protect the monarchy, it tainted it. It planted a seed of horror in the minds of the French people. Just 32 years later, the grandson of that king, Louis XVI, would stand in a different square before a different device, the guillotine. But this time, the crowd wouldn't be cheering for the king. They would be cheering for the executioner. If you had stood in the Place de Grève on that cold March day, watching the smoke rise from the ashes of a nobody, you wouldn't have known it, but you were watching the funeral pyre of the Ancien Régime. The king had won the day, but he had lost his soul. And history would never forget the 72 hours that France went mad.